This presentation is about drawing on synchronicity or meaningful coincidences to promote client well-being. There are many different types of synchronicity, but they all involve meaningful coincidence, especially which has an uncanny or numinous quality. I'll describe a case example of a man in his 50s with severe depression he'd had for 8 years and also an undiagnosed PTSD, a trauma reaction relating to the loss of his infant daughter from a medical condition 20 years earlier. He felt so guilty about his daughter's undignified funeral arrangements that he avoided visiting her gravesite lest he feel the compelling urge to take his life. After the first EMDR treatment session, he asked if I believed in synchronicity as a result of an uncanny booking time coincidence. And I said I was actually writing a book on it at the time. We both laughed, and I think that led him to be more open to tell me this story of numinous experience. After that session, apparently Gary went to bed that night thinking of his infant daughter. And after a while, he felt a pat on his head, inexplicably because his wife was asleep next to him. The following week after a therapy session, that night, the power went out about 3 o'clock. Just after he woke up, he saw his clock flashing beside the bed, and uncannily it came back on soon afterwards, just at a time that he'd normally wake up. He thought this was his daughter getting him a message. The following week, he saw a vision of his daughter's face in bed, and he thought that this was how she was looking to connect with him. He said the flashing clock and the pat on the head seemed too coincidental. His interpretation was that she knows I care about her, she knows that I know she's okay. He said it's all happening for a reason, the timing's perfect, it's put me in a fantastic mindset, I'm on the right track. This helped him fully resolve his traumatic grief and depression. He functioned better at work, he had a better relationship with family members, had minimal depressive and PTSD symptoms for 12 months afterwards, and that was documented using objective questionnaires. So I described Gary's case in more detail and other cases in my book, The Positive Psychology of Synchronicity, which also describes questions we can use to elicit this kind of experience. The conclusions are that synchronicity can be a transformative experience. It can bolster all the pillars of PERMA, the pillars of well-being. Synchronicity can be a sacred moment, as described by Ken Pargerman in his research on sacred experience and how that bolsters PERMA, but the client might only acknowledge it if given permission. Further resources to look up include our Synchronicity Unwrapped website and also my practice website at chrismackey.com.au, which also has podcasts on synchronicity.